All right, so we left off talking about Zwingli, right? We mentioned about him and a little bit of his perspective. Okay, that's a bit different than Lutheranism, Protestantism. All right, so I know we talked quite a bit about Martin Luther. We mentioned about how he obviously stood up against the Catholic Church and proclaimed and explained the 95 Theses, the arguments, and proved himself through what was that court hearing called again? What was it called? Naomi. The Diet of Worms. Good job. Anyway, what happened with Martin Luther? What happened? Did he just get killed right on the spot? Jason?
No.
No, he was viewed as a heretic, yeah. So, but what happened ultimately here? Chloe.
He was excommunicated.
Yes, good job. Who took him in? Who said, you know what? I'll protect you. I will make sure that you are protected. Jason.
Frederick the Wise.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I know the place. I know the place. Ozzy. I almost said Saxon.
Yes, you're right. Good. Good. All right. So Frederick the Wise and Saxon. Okay. Anyway, we're looking here in parts of kind of more of the eastern part of Germany. Right. So anyway, Frederick the Wise takes him in for terrorism. What was the catch though? What did Martin Luther have to do for Frederick the Wise? Audrina. Yeah, good job, right? So when it comes to the Bible, written in Latin, and well, Frederick the Wise said, hey, I think it's important that everybody has this connection to the Bible, can read it and make their own relationship up with God. Just like we're, I don't know, starting this new religion. Is that what Martin Luther? No, he did not, but ultimately that's what happens. Anyway, yeah, he translates the Bible to German, from Latin to German, and the printing press takes hold of it. Anyway, so then you'll see Protestantism and, well, obviously Catholicism. But anyway, we have other reformists too, like Zwingli here. Real quick. So why did the Catholic Church just come in and crush Saxony? What happened? There was a league that formed, right? A bond, a confederation. What was that league called? All right, Naomi, go ahead. Yeah, the Schmaltz League. Yeah, good job, right? So these German-speaking states bond together to try to protect themselves from the almighty power of the Catholic Church. Is there going to be a lot of religious wars? Yes, a lot of them, right? We're going to not focus too much on it. I know I mentioned about the 30 Years' War a little bit, and I mentioned a little bit about some of these other conflicts of religion, right? But yeah, this is going to stem a lot of death, a lot of chaos, a lot of revolts and revolutions. Again, Luther did not want this, but ultimately that's what happens when you take a lot of power away from the church. Anyway, this will lead to the Peace of Augsburg, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, and how the kings, the monarchs, all throughout Europe can decide if they're going to lead into Protestantism or Catholicism. Right? When you look at like modern day Germany, like I was showing you guys up here on the map, right? That's specifically where we're talking, where these kings decide whether or not they're going to be Protestant, Lutheran, or sticking with the old traditions of Catholicism. All right. Anyway, real quick with Zwingli. I know I got put off short yesterday. Zwingli was influenced by Martin Luther. He said, yeah, you know what? He's right. Okay. We should have our own connection with God through the Bible, right? We should not just listen to these corrupt Catholic Church officials. He also had an issue with these what? Where people would pay to make, get their sins forgiven. What were these things called here? Luna? Indulgences. Yeah, good job. He said, hey, enough of this. This is going way too far. The authority, the power, the corruption of the church needs to end right here. So he also had a lot of critiques, grievances with the church, just like Martin Luther. Anyway, when it comes to his viewpoint of church too, he did believe that church needs to be a little bit more simpler, right? We shouldn't have all these routines and traditions, right? We shouldn't be praising to these statues and these relics, these props within the church, right? Portraits and statues. So we actually should have more of a praise to God himself, right? When we're praising to these items, it just doesn't make any sense. So when you think about the modern day church today, well, Zwingli, his movement here, right, helped bring on that change. Anyway, with that, like I mentioned, sola scriptura, he believes that the interpretation, your relationship with God should be based on the Bible. No one else, right? No other religious leader. And he also breaks off from Luther, right? He kind of forms this new religion, right? This branch of Christianity, right? Because he had an issue with the communion, right? He believed that when it came to breaking the bread, right? When it came to drinking the wine or the grape juice, right? Let's say with communion, it wasn't actually Jesus' body. Now, it was symbolically meeting Jesus' body. Luther was up in arms about it, right? They actually met at this Martyr cloaking. And with that happening, Luther said, you're all wrong, you're all wrong. It actually was his body, it was actually his blood that people consumed to show this communion, this Eucharist, right? Anyway, with that happening, Luther showed his temper and actually did shake Zwingli's hand. He said, no, no, I am so fed up with this. You guys are really taking this religion into a different direction, which that's what happens, right? Like I mentioned yesterday, a good way to symbolically look at the Reformation is like this rock thrown up against a window or a mirror, right? It just doesn't break into two pieces, right? It shatters in all these different areas, fragments in all these different areas. And that's what's going to happen with Christianity. I think that's a good way to look at it, right? Martin Luther is that rock, so to speak, right? At first it breaks into two, and then it just shatters everywhere because everybody has a different interpretation of Christianity. All right, another one here, John Calvin, right? You maybe heard of John Calvin here before, Calvinist, right? His Calvinist religion. Anyway, real quick with Calvin and Zwingli, their religion will actually come together, which is unique. And the reason for it is because Zwingli literally died in battle, right? Fighting against these Catholic crusaders, so to speak, right? When this war breaks out, constant wars all throughout Europe with Protestantism and Catholicism, Zwingli leads the charge and actually dies on battle. And if you're a martyr like that, well, that's going to inspire more people to follow you. It just does, right? So obviously he dies, but his religion lives on, right? And his viewpoints, his perspectives live on. So a lot of people, because he died on battle, he's like, wow, he must have been sent by God himself. Anyway, John Calvin, right? One of the biggest things here when it comes to his version of Christianity, his version of religion is predestination, right? I'm sure you guys heard of predestination already. God has already chosen, right, who's going to be saved, right, when it comes to their salvation, right, when it comes to who these people are that are going to enter heaven, right? He kind of looked and critiqued at the church itself, obviously the indulgences, the corruption, and said, hey, this has gone too far, right? We need to try to sway away from this. And like I mentioned, when it comes to this salvation, the indulgences is one of these things he really critiqued, just like Martin Luther, just like Zwingli. So you can see them aligning together on these issues. But again, he comes up with this idea of predestination, that God is the true meaning behind salvation. And it doesn't matter about your good moral characteristics, your good ethics. Should people have them? Yeah, they should, right? But ultimately, God is the one that chooses who will be saved and who will not, right? So in other words, what we do here on earth, it does matter, but God ultimately is going to pick the ones that, with their salvation. All right, one thing I wanted to mention too with John Calvin is that he establishes a theocracy. Right? We talked about a theocracy yesterday. What is that? What is a theocracy? What is a theocracy? Jason is on fire. Go ahead.
It's basically kind of like this religious government with the one guy at the top and then it just goes down. So it's kind of like the Catholic Church.
Okay. Yeah, right. So when you think about government, the state, and church, religion, they're together. They're together. Right? So all the decisions made by the country, the state, right? It is decided upon by the religion. So whatever means of ethics or whatever means of decision making or principles that the religion has, the state follows with. Right? There is no separation of church and state. Oh, wait a minute. Okay, our founding fathers look at these theocracies and say, does this lead to war? Yeah, a lot of times it does. And let's face it, right? When you think about the Middle East today, Iran especially with this theocracy there. Are there always really good religions? No, sometimes they're bad, right? Sometimes when it comes to women's rights and women's ability, right, and opportunities, especially there in Iran, they don't have them. So maybe, just maybe, that's not the right way to go about it. Also, with certain religions, they want to see the death, the demise of others. So think about it. Theocracies, maybe not all the time the best thing. So when it comes to a theocracy, he does establish this. And well, after these constant wars, and we'll see the 30 Years' War here, which I talked a little bit about yesterday. Well, maybe that's just leading into anarchy. Maybe that's just leading into constant conflict and war, which it only does. So with our founding fathers, they look at this as an example, and this whole time period as an example, right? Our country is literally founded on religious freedom, right? Religion is a big part of the foundation of our country. And a lot of it stems from just the chaos that's happening here in Europe. So that's something to think about. Anyway, you can see here religious laws with this theocracy, establishing against any of these, I guess you could say, corrupted means of society. So adultery, fornication, swearing, gambling, missing church services, So you can see how some of these religions become very pure, right? Where they try to really outlaw any type of sin. So we'll talk about the Puritans here soon. We'll talk about the Anabaptists here soon. And well, if there's anything that clashes against this theocracy, death to all. Man. So it really goes to a severe ability. All right, is there any questions, guys, on John Calvin? Zwingli, go ahead.
What do you guys want?
What's that?
You
Well, he founded this religion in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland. So he establishes this theocracy. It's small at the time, but it leads to a lot of religious and holy wars. Will later stem from this. So he's before the 30 Years' War. I get that, but there's just constant conflict over this theocracy. The Catholicism, Catholics see this as a Bible. Okay, they're like, hey, the only way we can try to establish any type of presence to eliminate this kind of, in the Catholics' view, anarchical democracy is to eliminate it. So, in other words, to try to protect themselves, they're like, hey, we need to firmly establish ourselves in religion. Okay, so that's what I mean. And yeah, you'll see Geneva, right, being a part of a lot of these decisions when it comes to peace negotiations and war, which we'll talk about World War I, right, and then later down the line. But yeah, good question. Good question. All right. Anyway, last thing here I want to mention. Okay, like I mentioned with the Schmaldic League here, that's what I was talking about. Here in orange, right, as you can see in the center of Europe, in the parts of Eastern Germany, this confederation forms. So yeah, it starts with Frederick the Wise of Saxony and well, these other German-speaking states. You can see it kind of leads all the way up to where Berlin is, right? Parts of where Poland is nowadays, and this bond, this confederation forms to try to protect Protestantism, Lutheranism against the Catholic Church. And well, you can see here in kind of like a tannish color, right, more of like a yellowish goldish color, is the Catholic states of the time, right? When you think of Charles V, right, he's the new Holy Roman Emperor, and yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about these inquisitions here soon, and how they're going to try to do everything they can to disband any type of Christianity that breaks away from the Catholic Church or any rival religions. So they'll go on a murderous spree, right, a genocide against anyone that doesn't believe their viewpoints. So it does get ugly. It really does. Real quick, in 1555, there was this piece. What was this piece called again? We did talk about this. The Peace of what? Jason. Augsburg. Jason, you're killing it. Good job. Thank you. All right, the Peace of Augsburg, which gives the kings, the monarchs here, the decision, right? Whether or not they're going to choose Protestantism or Catholicism. That was it. That was it. So, yeah, when you get John Calvin that comes around, are they happy about this? No, they made this decision with the Peace of Augsburg, right? They're like, this guy here is going in this crazy anarchical way, right? We're only accepting this other version of Christianity, not all these millions of others. This is crazy. All right, so that's something to think about. All right, so other reformists of the time. There you go. There you go. I was going to have the bell ringer for you today, but I just pretty much talked about it. Is there any questions about Zwingli? Any questions about Calvin? All right, these are other reformists, okay, just like obviously Martin Luther, that explain their perspectives of Christianity, even if it's the slightest difference, right? Well, new religion form, boom, right there, okay? So I just want to make sure I mention other reformists. It wasn't just Martin Luther, but yeah, he's the one that really got the ball rolling. All right. What's that? Yeah, I can leave it up for you. Okay, I'm going to put up the terms for today then. We're going to talk about the Wars of the Roses, okay? We're going to mention about how England is going to go through its own reform as well. So it doesn't just stay here in Central Europe. Yeah, modern day Germany, what we're talking about, but it also is going to move up to England. Another second. All right, anyway, so when we think about the Anabaptists, okay, the Calvinists, which we just talked about with predestination, the Anabaptists, their version of Christianity is pretty much right in line with Lutheranism, Protestantism, but they believe when it comes to the baptism, right? I'm sure you guys may have seen the baptism before. Usually it's babies, right? Anyway, they decide it's like, hey, you know what? Babies really can't choose, infants, children can't choose what type of religion they want, or do they actually know their connection to God yet? So they say when it comes to the baptism, right? We need to wait later in their life, right? We need to make sure that they have an ability to make up their own mind before we go through this baptism. Does that make sense? So that's pretty much the different strand here, right? So yeah, like I mentioned, a lot of these kings, monarchs are going to lead in a way of protecting this chosen religion after the Peace of Augsburg. And that's what's going to stem a lot of wars, like the 30 Years' War. And a lot of these civil wars here that we're going to talk about in England. You good? All right. Here are your terms. We got the Wars of the Roses, the Tudor dynasty, and yes, Henry VIII. Right? We'll talk more about Henry VIII tomorrow, but I want to set the stage of what's happening in England. And real quick, we did mention in chapter 1, right? Towards the end of chapter 1, there was a war that spanned a long, long, long time. What was that war? What was it? Elena, go ahead. The 100 Years' War. So chapter 1, chapter 2, yeah, it overlaps. I get it, right? I get it. Anyway, when we're getting here towards the end of chapter 1, right, the 100 Years' War, that empire, that family, Naomi, you said it earlier. What was that empire called? That family in England that reached far down into parts of France? Yeah, good job. That empire is crumbling, right? After the 100 Years' War, France, I guess you could say, liberates this part of Europe, of this, what we know of France, and pushes England out of it. So this empire is kind of crumbling. It really is. And well, 100 years of war, that's going to cost a lot of money. So you gotta imagine here, England's not in a good standing whatsoever. And that's only going to allow a push for the throne. All right, with the Wars of the Roses, it's very, very, very confusing. There's so many names out there, so many people fighting for the throne. Well, I'm not really going to go into too much detail. I will show you a video that kind of recaps it. You guys ever hear of the show Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Yeah, Game of Thrones is based off of the Wars of the Roses, right? So whenever you think of Game of Thrones, think of the actual story here with the Wars of the Roses. And sometimes, I mean, it just is crazier than the show itself. It's unbelievable, right? Obviously, the books that came first, but with the Wars of the Roses, the biggest thing here to know, make sure you guys write it down, is that you have the Lancaster family, the Red Rose, right? The Lancaster, the Red Rose, versus the Yorks, the White Rose. So that's the main thing here to remember from the Wars of the Roses. This is a civil war amongst the family. And if you had a tie to it, if you had any type of lineage to either the Lancaster or the Yorks, well, you had an ability to fight for the throne. That's how it happened. It was just constant war and a fight for leadership. And then ultimately, we'll talk about it, leads to the Tudor dynasty. go ahead. All right, guys. So real quick, I'm going to go over this slide. I'm going to go through the Wars of the Roses pretty quick, just because there's a lot to it. And I'm just going to give you the basic rundown, just to set the stage for Henry VIII and the Reformation in England. All right. So it could be really, really confusing if you break down every single name. There's so many in it. It's just unimaginable. That's why it influenced the story, just like Game of Thrones, right? So when it comes down to this story here of these set of wars, it lasts a pretty long time. And if you just had a little bit of money and a direct tie to the throne, meaning you were, obviously a part of this bloodline, you could fight for it. That's how it went. It was just constantly a gauntlet, right, of war based off of a connection to the throne. And again, if you had a little bit of cash. The main thing here to know is that this is right after the 100 Years' War. So England, which we talked about, I know it's kind of a tie, this 100 Years' War, because it lasts so long, but France wins, right? They push England out of mainland Europe, right? Continental Europe. So as they do that, well, you got to imagine, England has to do something to pay for this war, the cost of this war. So what do they got to do? They got to raise what? No one likes this, Naomi? Taxes, right? So this is really going to tip the people off. So much so that, well, it's just a constant turnover of events, right? It comes to a point too where the king, which we'll talk about, Henry the Sixth, he goes into a mental breakdown, and as this happens, well, it just leaves open a vacuum, or the vacuum opens up. It's like, well, who can then lead? Who will be the new leader? We need someone to fill in, as Henry the Sixth is just kind of losing his mind, so to speak. Right. So as that happens, you get the Lancaster family, the Red Rose, and then the York family, the White Rose. So that's the main thing here to take from this, guys. You get the Lancasters versus the Yorks, and they're symbolically shown with their roses. Like I mentioned, if you go down to Lancaster today, right, a lot of times when you see it on the highway, I think it's 322, right, you'll see actually a red rose on a lot of the bridges, right, even restaurants named after the red rose. And then if you go to York, the same thing. Right, on 83, right, on your way down there on a lot of the bridges, you'll see a white rose, which is named after these families, which is pretty cool. It's pretty neat. Anyway, they're kind of like twin cities, kind of, so to speak. I know they're not a huge, massive city, but they're kind of, obviously you can see the bond, the relationship between the two. Right, the main thing to note is after this constant warfare, constant struggle, well, there's a different Henry that comes around. Right, he'll be known as Henry the Seventh. Oh, geez, of course. But he was a relative to the Lancaster family, right? So he was a Red Rose, okay? His name was Henry Tudor, right? So it brings on this Tudor dynasty that we may have heard of before. Anyway, as this is going in constant chaos and anarchy in England, Henry Tudor's like, I'm going to put an end to this real quick. So he comes to England and, well, he wins. He combines his forces with the Lancaster family, which he was tied to. And he wins. He defeats the York family. As this happens, though, he realizes that you got to do something to just bring on the peace, right? You got to do something to make sure that this doesn't constantly just go into war and conflict and civil war, right? So he marries a person into the York family, right? He marries into the York family. So they combine the roses together into what we see here in the middle, the Tudor rose. I know what you're thinking. He married his relative. Yes, right? I get that. But there's a way to try to keep this stability, right? Try to keep this stable within England. So again, I know there's a lot more to it, right? I get that. But this is setting the stage to what we know as the Tudor dynasty. And this constant civil war, this constant bloodshed was obviously fascinating, right? So much so that they literally wrote books off of it, created a whole movie series, an HBO series off of it, right? Known as Game of Thrones. All right, I'm gonna show you a video here. You guys like to write notes about the Wars of the Roses, that'd be great, right? It goes in a little bit more detail, talks about specific kings, leaders, and how this leads into the ending where Henry Tudor claims the throne. And he combines the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster together to make this Tudor dynasty. And you can see the rose in the middle. Pretty cool, pretty cool. All right, so I'm gonna play this video for you guys. It's a TED Ed. It's really neat. And yeah, it sees the references to Game of Thrones. You guys maybe shouldn't be watching. It's pretty mature. I tell you what. But